Elwyn Ashcombe folded her father's letter into the lining of her cloak and walked out through the Gatehouse arch, without once looking back at the house that had, briefly, foolishly, been hers. The Dowager Duchess had given her until the noon bell to be gone, and the bell had already tolled twice more than it needed to, before Elwyn finished fitting what remained of her life into a single trunk. The morning smelled of wet stone and wood smoke, and, underneath both, of the low fields beyond the park, sour and standing with water that should long since have drained away. Her breath showed white in the archway. Somewhere behind her, in the warm room she was not permitted to cross again, a clock she had wound every Sunday for a year struck the quarter, and did not care that it struck it for someone else now. She had one trunk, one cloak, and in her pocket a defaced halfpenny with 4 notches filed into its rim, smoothed by 10 years of her own thumb, until the king's head on it had worn to a suggestion of a face. Her father had made it for her the winter she turned 7, to teach her to carry a number in her hand before she could yet carry one in her head, and she held it now the way another woman might have held a rosary. Nettie Fisher stood at the Gatehouse door with her arms folded hard across her apron, as though she could hold herself together only by main force. "You are not to cry in front of her," Elwyn said. Nettie's chin came up. "I am not the one they are turning out into the wet, madam," she said. "And if I choose to cry over it, that is my own business, and not her Grace's." The Dowager Duchess came down the Gatehouse steps herself to see it done, which Elwyn understood, even then, to be a kind of respect, though a cruel one. A lesser woman would have sent a servant and stayed by the fire. Cordelia Ashcombe stood very straight in the cold, her mourning brooch pinned high at her throat, and she did not raise her voice, because she never did. "You will find the coach waiting at the crossroads," she said. "It will take you as far as Belcote, and no further, and I think you will agree that is further than you have any right to expect. I have taken nothing from this house that was not given to me freely," Elwyn said, and her own voice surprised her by staying level. "That is a question for the assizes, not for me," said the Dowager, and touched the brooch at her throat the way another woman might have touched a wound, and turned back up the steps without another word, her skirts making a sound on the wet stone, like a page being turned too fast to read. It was old Tam Hollis, the gatekeeper, who came out last, when the Dowager's door had shut, and pressed a twist of paper into Elwyn's glove, saying nothing at all, only nodding once, the way a man nods at a thing he has decided not to be talked out of. Inside the twist, when she opened it a mile down the road, was not money, which she had half expected and would have refused, but a torn corner of ledger paper, foxed at the edge, with a column of figures on it in a hand she did not recognize, and a single word underlined twice that she did recognize, because it was the name of a field her own father had walked 100 times. Sedge. She did not know yet what it meant. She only knew, in the particular way a trained eye knows before the trained mind has caught up to it, that the column did not balance, and that a column which does not balance is not lying to you. It is only asking you to look again. Belcote was 2 hours off, by a road that had not been mended since the spring, and Elowyn Ashcombe sat with her hands folded over the torn page and the smoothed halfpenny, and did not let herself cry either. Not because Nettie had shamed her out of it, but because there was, she found, a great deal of room inside grief for arithmetic, if a woman knew how to use it, and her father had taught her nothing if not that. Belcote received her the way a poor village receives anyone come down in the world, which is to say with more honesty than the Gatehouse had managed in a 12-month. Aunt Prue kept a single room over the wash-house at the edge of the green, and the smell of it was lye and wet wool, and the particular sourness of linen boiled too many times, and Elowyn found she did not mind it, because it was at least a smell that told the truth about itself. Her aunt was her father's sister, broad through the shoulders from 30 years at the copper, and she took one look at Elowyn's trunk and said, "Well," and set the kettle on, which in that house was as good as an embrace. "You'll sleep in the truckle," Prue said. "It is short for you, but it is dry, which is more than half the beds in this village can claim this autumn, what with the low fields standing in water the way they are." "Why do the fields stand in water, Aunt?" Elowyn asked, because the word on the torn page had not left her since the crossroads. "Because the cuts have not been scoured since your father died, girl, and no one since him has troubled to walk them," said Prue, wringing a sheet with both fists, as though it had personally offended her. 3 years the estate has paid for the scouring of those cuts every Michaelmas, and 3 years the water has stood higher instead of lower. And if you ask me, that is not a mystery so much as an insult. But nobody asked me. Elowyn set the torn ledger corner on the table between them, smoothing it flat with 2 fingers. Aunt Prue looked at the column, then at her niece, then at the door, as if checking that no one had followed the paper into the room. "Where did you come by that?" she asked. "The gatekeeper," Elowyn said. "He didn't say why." "He didn't need to," Prue said. "Your father used to say, 'A man who steals from the ground steals slower than a man who steals from a strong-box, but he steals just as sure, because the ground can't shout for help.'" It was Nettie who came a week later, on her half-day, with her boots caked to the ankle, and news she had clearly been saving up the whole walk to deliver in the right order. "His Grace is expected home within the fortnight," she said, before she had even sat down. "And Her Grace has been telling anyone who will listen that you ran off owing money to half the tradesmen in Belcote, which is a lie so plain that even Mrs. Kettridge at the draper's didn't believe it, and Mrs. Kettridge believes everything. And Mr. Vane has been made steward in all but name while His Grace is away," Nettie went on, dropping into the one good chair, as though her legs had been waiting all the way from the hall to give out. "With the keys to the estate office on his own ring now, if you please, and the account books moved into his private room, where nobody sees them but him." Elowyn went very still over the washing she had been folding. "What account books?" she asked. "All of them," Nettie said. "But it's the home farm ledger he keeps closest, the drainage accounts and the rents together, locked in the same drawer as his pistols, which I only know because I dust that room, and I am not in the habit of forgetting a locked drawer that used to stand open." Elowyn took the torn corner from where she kept it, now folded inside her father's letter, and laid it on the table between them, and Nettie leaned in and read the underlined word twice before she spoke again. "That's the Sedgefield account," she said slowly. "I've seen the fair copy of that page in the estate office a dozen times. and it never once had a number like that written against it. Then someone tore this page out of somewhere it wasn't meant to be found, Elowyn said, and someone else wants very badly for nobody to ask why. Outside the wash-house window the light was going grey and low over the green, and far off, past the last cottages, she could just make out the shape of the Hall's Gatehouse tower against the sky. One window in it lit gold, small and steady as a held breath, and she watched it until Nettie rose to go, and did not tell her aunt, that night, or any night soon after, how long she had sat at the window, watching a light that was not, could never again be, her own, to come home to. The fair at Belcote fell that year on the second Sunday after Michaelmas, and it was there, among the trestle stalls and the smell of roasting chestnuts and wet canvas, that Elowyn saw her husband for the first time since the Gatehouse. He came with his mother on one side of him, and, a half-step behind, a young woman in blue whom Elowyn did not know, and whose bonnet was better made than any bonnet had any business being at a village fair. Julian Ashcombe had not changed in the shape of him, tall in that way that made rooms rearrange themselves quietly around him. But there was a stillness in his face now that she did not recognize, and his hand, she saw, went twice in as many minutes to the signet ring on his smallest finger, turning it, though there was no dust on it to turn away. She had not meant to be seen. She had come only for thread, and for the particular relief of a crowd that did not know her story yet, and it was Vane who spoiled that, stepping neatly into her path with his hat already coming off, all civility. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, as though the title cost him nothing to give her, though everyone within 10 feet turned to hear whether he would give it. "It is a small district, Mr. Vane," she said. "It is difficult to leave it entirely, even when one is asked to." His smile arrived the way a curtsy arrives, correct and finished before it properly began, and by then the dowager had seen them, and steered her son toward the stall with the ease of a woman steering a boat she had rowed a long time. "Julian," she said. Only that, but it was enough. He stopped where he stood, the way a man stops at a name that is also an order. Elowyn watched him look at her across 10 feet of trampled grass and chestnut smoke, and watched him decide in the space of 2 breaths not to cross it. "Lady Frances," said the dowager, drawing the young woman in blue forward with a hand at her elbow, "you have not yet had the pleasure. Elowyn has left our household, as you may have heard, under circumstances the family does not care to discuss in public." "I had not heard the particulars," Lady Frances said, and her eyes went once quickly to Elowyn's face, and then away, with an expression Elowyn could not read and did not have leisure to try. It was Julian who spoke next, and his voice, when it came, had the careful flatness of a man reciting something he had rehearsed rather than felt. "I am told there are matters concerning the household accounts that must be settled before anything further can be said between us," he said. "I would not wish to settle them in a public field." "Then you had better come to the wash-house at Belcote and settle them somewhere private," Elowyn said, "before you settle them entirely without me." He did not answer that. He only looked at her a moment longer, and touched the ring again, and let his mother turn him toward the horses, and Elowyn stood in the noise of the fair with her thread unbought in her hand, and understood, with the particular clean pain of a thing finally said plainly, that her husband had come home, and had chosen for the second time not to ask her a single question before believing he already knew the answer. He came to the wash-house 3 nights later, alone, on foot, without so much as a groom to hold his horse at the crossroads. And Aunt Prue took one look at his boots and his bearing, and found urgent business in the yard that kept her out of the room for the better part of an hour. He would not sit. He stood by the cooled hearth turning the ring, and Elowen sat with her hands folded in her lap, the way she had learned, as a girl, to sit when a column of figures would not balance, and shouting at it only wasted the candle. "I did not believe you stole from us," he said at last. "That is not the same as believing me innocent of everything else your mother said," Elowen answered. He flinched at that, very slightly, the way a man flinches when a true thing lands exactly where it was aimed. "I believed," he said, "that there had been some mismanagement, some extravagance. I did not think you a thief, only careless, and I told myself carelessness was a smaller thing to forgive than theft, and easier to explain to the county, and I let that be enough of an answer, because London was 6 days off, and my mother's letters were always so certain." "You let a certain letter stand in for a question you never troubled to ask me directly," Elowen said. "That is not the same as trusting your own wife, Julian, whatever smaller name you give it." He was silent long enough that the fire, low as it was, popped once in the grate, and neither of them moved toward it. "I have never in my life defied my mother in anything that mattered," he said finally, and his voice had dropped, the way a confession always drops below the register of ordinary speech. "She raised me alone from the time I was 11. She managed this estate through years I do not remember, because I was too small to be told how bad they were. I do not know how to disbelieve her, without feeling I am pulling out the floor from under both our feet at once." "Then you had better learn quickly," Elowen said, "because your steward has moved the home farm ledger into a locked drawer with his pistols. And my father used to say, a man does not lock away a thing that only shows him careless." Julian's hand stopped on the ring. "What do you know of the home farm ledger?" he asked, and there was something new in his voice now. Not suspicion of her, but of the room itself, of the house he had left in another man's keeping. "Only that someone tore a page from it, and gave it to a woman with nowhere left to take it but her aunt's wash-house," Elowen said, and set the torn corner on the mantel between them, where the firelight could reach it. He did not touch it. He looked at it a long while, and then at her, and something in his face that had been held very carefully in place since the fair began, very slowly, to come apart. A rider came up the lane before either of them spoke again, and it was Vane's own groom, with a note in Vane's own hand, asking whether his grace required the carriage brought round, since it was known abroad that he had walked out alone after dark, and her grace was anxious for him. Julian read it twice, and folded it, and looked at Elowen with an apology he did not yet have the words for. "I must go back," he said, "not because I wish to." "If you go back with nothing settled," she said, "you will go back believing exactly what your mother wishes you to believe, because there will be no one there to tell you otherwise until it is too late to matter." He left without answering that either, and it was 3 weeks before Elowen understood what he had meant by it, when a lawyer's clerk came to the wash-house door with papers already drawn, offering a settlement of £400 a year, and her signature, on a line that renounced, in language so careful it took her a full quarter-hour to parse it, any further claim upon the Ashcombe name or estate, in exchange for a quiet withdrawal to whichever county she pleased, provided it was not this one. She signed it, she told herself, folding the clerk's copy into the same lining that held her father's letter, that she signed it to spare Julian a scandal that would otherwise be laid at his door for the rest of his life, and that £400 a year was more independence than any woman of her birth had any right to expect. And both of those things were true, and neither of them was the real reason, which she did not say aloud, even to Aunt Prue, and which was only this: that she could not bear, any longer, to be the thing that was fought over in a house that had already decided, before she ever set foot in it, what she was. It was Aunt Prue, sorting through the last of her dead brother's effects that winter to make room in the loft, who found the letter that changed the shape of everything. It had been folded into the spine of an old rent book, in Thomas Hale's own hand, dated the January before he died, and it began without greeting, as though he had known whoever found it would already understand who it was for. "To whoever comes after me in this office," he had written, "I set this down because a man ought not to carry a suspicion to his grave without at least writing it where someone honester than myself might find it. The sedge cuts have been paid for scouring 3 years running, and stand higher with water each spring than the year before, which any drainage man will tell you is not the way of nature, but the way of a bill paid for work never done. I have said as much to young Mr. Vane, who manages these accounts under his Grace the Elder's eye, and he has told me I am an old man, seeing thieves in a wet season, and perhaps I am. But I have kept my own tally of the difference between what is paid and what is dug, against the day someone with more standing than a steward's word might trouble to add it up." Aylwin read it 3 times by the lamp before she trusted her voice enough to read it aloud to her aunt, and when she had finished, Prue sat a long while with her hands still in her lap, which for a woman who had not stopped moving in 30 years was itself a kind of grief. "He never told me," Prue said at last. "He never told anyone who could do anything with it." "He was waiting to be sure," Aylwin said, "and then he ran out of time to be sure in." It was Mr. Corbin, the old parish clerk who had taught Aylwin her letters before her father taught her her sums, who came the following Sunday to look over both papers, the torn ledger corner and the old letter together, spreading them on Aunt Prue's table with the careful reverence of a man handling something that might yet be evidence in a court. "Your father was right to wait," he said. "A suspicion without a figure is only spite in a clean shirt. But a suspicion with a figure attached to it, and a second figure that does not match the first, that is a different animal altogether. That is a thing a magistrate must listen to, whether he wishes to or not." "How do I get the second figure?" Aylwin asked. "You do not get it," Corbin said. "You are owed a side of it, if you know where to stand and what to ask for. The estate keeps a fair copy of every account with the county clerk of assize once a year, filed and forgotten, because no one ever thinks to look at a thing that has already been filed. If the drawer in the steward's room holds the true figures, and the filed copy holds the false ones, then somewhere between those 2 papers is a man who cannot be in both places honestly." "He is right to fear you, girl," Corbin added, folding his spectacles with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just handed someone a key he has kept polished for years, without knowing whose lock it was for. Not because you are dangerous, because you are the one person left in this whole county who was taught to read a column the way your father read one, all the way to the bottom. And most men who steal are only ever afraid of being added up correctly. That night, walking Prue's yard alone in the cold for the air of it, Aylwin turned the smoothed halfpenny over in her pocket, 4 notches under her thumb, and thought of her father, bent over the same kind of table, teaching her that a column which will not balance is not lying to you. It is only asking you to look again. And she understood, with a calm that surprised her more than any grief had, that she was going to go and look again, whatever it cost her to do it. The county clerk's office at Marlow kept its filed accounts in a back room that smelled of dust and tallow, and the particular mildew of paper that has not been opened in a long while. And it took Aylwin 2 visits, and the last of her settlement's first quarter payment, pressed discreetly into the clerk's palm as a fee for his trouble, before he would let her sit alone with the Ashcombe estate's filed drainage accounts for the 3 years her father's letter named. She copied the figures onto a fresh sheet, with a steadiness of hand she did not feel, and rode back to Belcourt with them folded against her heart, the way another woman might have carried a letter from a lover. Nettie brought her, 2 days later, and at considerable risk to her own place, a single page torn in the same hand and on the same paper as the corner Tam had given her at the Gatehouse, taken, she would only say, from a drawer that had been left unlocked one careless evening. The 2 sets of figures did not match. They did not match in the particular, damning way that told Aylwin exactly what she was looking at, because the difference between them, added across 3 years, came to a sum so precise it could only be a man's private account of his own theft, kept the way a careful thief always keeps one, out of an old habit no dishonesty ever fully unlearns. It was Vane himself she went to see, not Julian, not the dowager, because Corbin had told her plainly that a wise woman does not accuse a clever man before she has heard what he will say to his own face. And she found him in the estate office at midday, civil as ever, his cravat pin exactly straight, a decanter and 2 glasses already set out, as though he had been expecting her for weeks. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, rising, and did not sit again until she had. "You have been busy," he said, when she laid both papers on the desk between them without preamble. "I have been careful," she said, "which is not the same thing, though I think you have taught me the difference." He looked at the figures a long moment, and did not reach for either paper, which she noted, because a guilty man reaches, and an intelligent one knows better. "You will find, if you take this to a magistrate, that the estate was failing before I ever touched a ledger," he said. "Your father-in-law left debts his son has never been told the full size of. I have spent 3 years keeping this family solvent by means that would not survive a moralist's daylight, and I make no apology for it, because the alternative was a debtor's auction of everything you married into." "You have kept it solvent," Aylwin said, "by paying yourself first and calling the difference drainage." He smiled then, the smile that arrived like a curtsy, correct and over before it began. "The young always mistake arithmetic for cruelty," he said. "I am not cruel, Mrs. Ashcombe. I am only exact. And exactness has never once been forgiven in this county, though it has quietly kept half the great houses in its standing." "Then let us be exact together, before a magistrate, and see which of us the county forgives," she said, and rose, and gathered both papers, before he could think of a reason to ask for them back. And it was only at the door, with her hand already on the latch, that she heard him speak again, low, almost gentle, the voice of a man laying down a card he had held in reserve a long while. "Your husband signed a settlement releasing you from any claim on this estate," he said. "A woman with no claim has no standing to bring a magistrate anywhere. You had better think, before you go further, what it will cost you to be right about a thing no court will let you say aloud." She did not answer him. She walked out into a yard gone white with the first hard frost of the year, and stood a moment with both papers pressed flat against her ribs under her cloak, and understood that he had just told her, as clearly as a civil man ever tells anyone anything, exactly where the fight would actually be fought. It was the dowager herself who found her in the yard, come out to see why the estate office door stood open in such cold. And it was the worst possible arrangement of people that the world could have produced in that half-minute, because Vane came out behind her, and Julian, riding in from the home farm with mud to his knees, came round the stable block at exactly the moment his mother's voice rose, for the first time in Elowyn's hearing, above its ordinary level. "She has been in the estate office, alone, with papers she has no right to touch," the dowager said to her son, as though Elowyn were not standing 3 feet away and perfectly capable of answering for herself. "I did not think even you would come creeping back to steal from us a second time," she said then, turning, and Elowyn felt the accusation land the way a struck bell lands, all through the bone before the ear has even finished hearing it. "I have taken nothing that was not evidence of a theft already committed against this family," Elowyn said, and held up the papers, though her hand, she noticed distantly, was not quite steady doing it. "Evidence," the dowager repeated, in a voice that made the words sound like a child's excuse. "Mr. Vane has managed this estate faithfully since before you ever set foot in it. Julian," she said, not raising her voice now, which was somehow worse, "you will not let a woman who has already signed away her claim to this family come back and accuse the one man who has kept it solvent in your absence." Julian looked at his mother, and then at Elowyn, and then, for a long moment, at nothing at all, at some middle distance where a man stands when he cannot yet bear to choose which woman's face to read. "Give me the papers," he said finally to Elowyn, and his voice was not unkind, but it was not yet certain either, and she understood, handing them over, that she had won herself perhaps 1 week of his doubt, and nothing firmer than that. It was not enough. Within the day the dowager had sent for the local magistrate on her own authority, not to hear Elowyn's evidence, but to lay information against her for the unlawful taking of estate documents. And it was Vane, smooth and sorrowful, who suggested to the magistrate over sherry that the family's honour would be far better served by a quiet withdrawal than by a public airing that could only humiliate a woman already so plainly unwell in her judgment. Elowyn rode back to Belcott that night with an officer of the law's warning in her ears, and both papers, thank Providence, still folded inside her stays, where Vane's men had not thought to look. And she stood a long while in Aunt Prue's yard, under a sky gone hard and starless, and understood that she had been right about everything, and that being right, in that county, on that night, had brought her exactly to the edge of ruin, and not 1 step further. It was Julian who came the next evening, and it was he this time who would not sit, standing instead by the cold hearth with the 2 papers spread on the table, where his hands would not quite touch them either. "I have had them examined," he said. "A man from the bank at Marlow, not one of ours, went through both sets of figures this morning. He says the difference is exact enough to be a confession, if a magistrate can be got to see it that way." "Then get one," Elowen said. "It is not so simple," he said. And there, at last, was the offer she had been waiting 3 months without knowing it, dressed as reasonableness. "If this goes before the assizes, my mother's name is dragged through it, whether she is guilty of anything worse than trusting the wrong man, and Vane will make certain of that, because it is the only card he has left to play. There is a quieter road. He is prepared to resign the stewardship and leave the county within the month if no charge is laid, and to repay what can be traced. My mother need never answer for anything beyond an old woman's misplaced confidence." "And I would be paid off a second time," Elowen said, "and go on being the woman who was sent away twice and asked no questions either time." "That is not the quiet road, Julian. That is the same road with better manners." He was silent long enough that the fire popped once more in the grate. "A column that will not balance is not lying to you," she said, quoting her father's words back into the room, the way she had heard them 1,000 times as a child. "It is only asking you to look again. And I have looked again, Julian, longer and harder than anyone in that house was ever willing to. And I will not fold the paper back up now because it is inconvenient to have looked. If the truth costs your mother something, then it costs her something, and she will survive it, because I have survived a great deal more this winter than an old woman's embarrassment." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, the same something that had begun to come apart by the fire weeks before, finished coming apart now, quietly, without drama, the way a held breath finally goes out of a man. "Then I will not ask you to sign anything else," he said. "But I cannot promise you what it will look like. Once it is said aloud in a room my mother cannot leave." "I have never once asked you for a promise about how it looks," she said. "Only that it be true, and said where everyone can hear it at the same time." He left before dawn, without touching her hand, and it was 2 days later that Nettie arrived, breathless, with the news that had, in the end, decided everything. That His Grace had gone to his mother directly and told her, in words the whole servants' hall had somehow contrived to overhear, through a door not quite shut, that he meant to lay the ledgers before the quarter-day audit at Lady Day, before every tenant on the estate, and let the figures speak for themselves, in front of witnesses no one could later unhear. Lady Day audit had always been held in the long room at Ashcombe Hall, tenants filing in by rank and holding to pay their rents and hear the year's accounts read out. A ceremony so old, no one living could say when it had begun. And it was into this room, full of damp wool coats and the smell of pipe smoke and spring mud tracked in on 40 pairs of boots, that Elowen Ashcombe walked for the first time since the Gatehouse, on her husband's arm, in front of every soul on the estate who had heard some version of why she left it. The dowager sat at the head of the room in the chair that had been hers for 30 years, her mourning brooch pinned high, and did not look at Elowen at all, which was its own kind of answer. Vane stood near the table where the ledgers lay, composed, his cravat pin exactly straight, and it was he who spoke first, smoothly, regretfully, suggesting that whatever private matter His Grace wished to raise might be better raised in private, out of respect for the tenants' time. "We will not keep them long," Julian said, and nodded to Elowyn, and it was she who stepped to the table and opened the true copy beside the filed copy, side by side, the way Corbin had shown her, so that anyone near enough could see with their own eyes that the two did not agree. "I will read the figures as they were filed with the county, and then as they were kept in this office," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. "So that everyone in this room hears the same words at the same time, and no one afterward need take it on my say alone." She read them. The room, which had been full of the ordinary shuffle of boots and coughs, went very still by the third year, the way a congregation goes still at a name read out that everyone already half suspected. It was then that Frances Merrow rose from where she had been sitting quietly at the back, and asked, in a clear voice that surprised the whole room, including Elowyn, whether she might add one figure of her own, and produced a receipt, folded soft with handling, for £200, paid to her father the previous autumn, by Mr. Vane's own hand, described in his own writing as a repayment of an old debt her father had never, to her certain knowledge, been owed. "I did not understand until this moment what it was repayment for," Frances said, and looked at Vane for the first time since she had risen, not unkindly, only very steadily. "But I understand it now, and I will not have my family's name used to dress a theft in the clothes of an honest debt." It was Vane who moved then, one motion too fast, his hand going for the true ledger on the table as though he might yet close it or carry it off. And it was the dowager, of all the room, who caught his wrist before Julian could cross the floor to do it, her rings hard against his cuff, and said, in a voice gone suddenly old and plain, "Take your hand off that book, sir, before you make a thief of yourself in front of witnesses as well as on paper." She rose then, slowly, and turned to face the room, and to Elowyn, and said the thing Elowyn had least expected to hear from her in this life or any other. "I was wrong," the dowager said. "I believed a man because his manners were easier to trust than a girl's honesty, and I have very nearly ruined 2 lives over the comfort of that mistake, and I do not ask to be forgiven for it today, only to be allowed to begin earning it." Vane left the room within the hour, courteously, his hat under his arm, pausing at the door only to say to Elowyn, with something that might almost have been respect, that he had underestimated exactly one thing in the whole business, which was how far a woman would go to make a column balance, and that he would not make that mistake again, wherever he went next. And then he was gone, and the room he left behind him began, slowly, to fill again with the ordinary noise of tenants who had just watched something they would tell their grandchildren about. Julian found her afterward in the empty long room, the ledgers still open on the table, the last of the tenants' boots fading down the drive, and it was there, with no one left to overhear them, that he finally said the thing he had not been able to say by any fire all winter. "I let my mother's certainty stand in for my own courage," he said. "I told myself I was keeping the peace of the house. I was only keeping myself from having to choose. And you paid for that far longer than any wife should have to pay for a husband's cowardice." "It was not only cowardice," Elowyn said. It was also 30 years of a woman who raised you alone and taught you to trust her judgment before your own. And I do not think either of us will finish forgiving her by supper. But I am willing to begin, if she is willing to earn it, the way she said. I have terms, she said then, before he could answer, because Corbin had told her, and her own father's example had told her longer, that a thing worth having was worth naming plainly before it was accepted. I will not be sent from this house again on anyone's certainty but a magistrate's proof. The estate books will pass through my hand as well as any steward's from this day, because I have shown this county what comes of no one troubling to add a column twice. Your mother may keep her rooms and her place at this table, but the Gatehouse where I was sent out is hers to choose or refuse, not to command me into again. And you will ask me, Julian, before you ever again decide for both of us what is easiest to believe. He took her hand then in the empty room and turned the signet ring once more, though this time, she saw, it was only an old habit finishing itself out, not a man bargaining with his own conscience. I accept every one of your terms, he said, and I will add one condition of my own, which is that you never again let me go a whole winter without being told plainly what you think, however hard the season. It was the dowager, in the end, who chose the Gatehouse, unbidden, before the month was out, moving her few things into the small rooms above the arch, with a dignity that made the choice look less like exile and more like penance freely taken. And she kept, that first spring, a hive of bees in the Gatehouse garden, and grew by the second to be visited most fine afternoons by a granddaughter who had not existed the autumn Elowin was sent away through that same arch in the rain. A year on, almost to the day, Elowin came up the drive at dusk with her own daughter's hand in hers, and the Gatehouse window was lit gold and steady, the way it had been lit the night she watched it from Aunt Prue's. And the old dowager came to the door herself, her mourning brooch still pinned at her throat, and knelt, with some effort now, to press into the child's small palm a smoothed halfpenny with a fifth notch freshly filed into its rim, saying only that a girl ought to learn to carry a number in her hand before she carried one in her head. And Elowin, standing in the archway where she had once walked out, believing she would never be let back through it, found the kettle already on. If this house sat with you a while tonight, the way it once sat with me, stay by the fire a moment longer before you go out into your own evening. I keep thinking of that torn corner of ledger paper, the one small scrap that started all of it, and of how much of what mattered in this whole story turned out to live in a column of figures nobody wanted read twice. And I would love to hear in the comments which moment held you the way it held me, whether it was the Gatehouse, or the audit table, or that last kettle on the hob. And if a story like this one is the kind you want waiting for you again. Staying with channel name is the surest way to have another lit and ready.
The kettle is on here too, as it happens. Another tale already catching at the wick. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to whoever is waiting for you at your own gate.